Csikszentmihalyi was often citing his own adolescence during and after World War II as a formative experience that prepared him for, life researching what he researched. And I know that you and him, when you spoke, also spoke about some of his hobbies and his own ways of accessing flow. So I'm curious if you can give a breakdown of, your sense of his personal life, his hobbies, and how that impacted his research and contributions.
Okay, so there are about 500,000 people who are probably better qualified to answer this question than me, because I definitely did not know Mike super well, but he was certainly, shaped early on by like the fact that you know, the adults around him were miserable despite having money, power, and education. Also, that was the other thing. They were incredibly well educated people. They're still miserable, right? So information alone, money, like none of these things were solving it, and personalities fell apart during the war in the face of hardship. And what I think is interesting about that is, you sort of touched on this earlier. We touched about so many people who were eminent creatives, these scientists and artists, whatever. He looked at kind of creativity across the board, business leaders as well, all had this really painful childhood. And in an interview he did somewhere along the way, I don't remember exactly where or when, he was taught, somebody asked him about this. And he said, you have to learn to, if your life is satisfying as a child, you're not going to learn to struggle enough to be able to get into the challenge skills balance regularly. You're not going to learn the skills you need because you're already satisfied your life. If you grow up with a safe childhood and you're satisfied, you're not going to learn that to get to when you're dissatisfied. Oftentimes what you have to do is push on the challenge skills balance, go harder, right? Things like that. So I think part of his childhood was what he saw and what is the meaning of meaning, but part of it is he learned how to struggle gracefully, right? He learned how to push on the challenge skills balance. One of the things that always sort of stuck out with me, he came to America with some like $1.20 to his name, or some ridiculous no sum of money. It wasn't maybe $1.20, but it was a very little amount of money. It may have been $1.20, and no ability to speak English, right? Couldn't afford to get a psychological education in Europe. Said I could figure out how to get a scholarship in America, and showed up with no money and didn't speak the language, and then wrote wow. And on top of that, was a mountaineer, was a rock climber, was a serious avid outdoorsman. This I definitely learned from him over the years. And that was, the last conversation we had, which I wrote about in that newsletter, is I had been reading, I think it was Flow and the Foundations of Positive Psychology. I want to say it's that. And there's a interview with him that was translated out of Italian for that book that I had never seen before because it was only in Italian. And in it, he's talking about his rock climbing experiences. And I started to realize that he was a lot more serious of rock climber than I ever believed. And I think one of the reasons I didn't believe he was ever a real rock climber is because he's built like a fullback. And guys who are built like fullbacks don't climb rocks as a general rule. They're mountaineers, but rock climbing is, people tend to be built like me or Alex Honnold. We're skinny and tall and lanky, and you know what I mean? I'm not tall, he is. But, he was a much more rabid outdoorsman. Even if it was just playing with his dog. The very first conversation we ever had, I was working on a small furry prayer, and I was starting to notice that I was getting into what I thought were flow states with the animals, our pack at Rancho de Chihuahua. And I had no idea flow across species lines. And that was my first time I reached out to him, as I emailed him. I was like, you don't know me. I've written about flow a little bit, and maybe you've heard of me and blah, 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 but do you think maybe just possibly, you know what I mean? And I was terrified. I was like, I'm now reaching out to the godfather of flow psychology with what is probably a crazy question, right? Do dogs get into flow? At that point, when I was asking the question, was a crazy question. The first thing he emailed me back immediately, he's like, of course, I get into flow with my dog every day when we play fetch. If you want to talk more about this, here's my number. And like, that was how we met, basically, talking about animals in flow. And I remember thinking, even back then, I didn't know him and his work nearly as well, but I remember thinking, oh my God, that was brave. I mean, I was a journalist. I interviewed scientists all the frickin' time and asked them crazy questions. And very few people are willing to, like, we had just started to scientifically prove that animals had emotions and these were real, and like dogs getting it, like this was new. I don't even know if I think the University of Arizona work on dogs and flow and ferrets and no flow had been done already, right? But it was just, I was so impressed by it, and I was so impressed that he was willing to like tell the truth and didn't, I was willing to believe all that stuff because I understood the neurochemistry and he was just going off of psychology and experience. And I remember thinking, wow, that was really brave and intuitive, and like he was right and blah blah. But I don't know how I ended up talking about dogs, childhood experience, outdoors. So even that, like, he was always, it seems like, around animals, in nature, in mountains. His students, would tell stories about him coming back from weekend trips in nature with bruises all over his face and body. And, he had a place in Montana and was often out there hiking and whatnot. And it's not lost on me that, well, first of all, so many of the flow philosophers, one way or another, have hiked through the mountains. Nietzsche did it on a daily basis. Like there seems to be something about walking through the mountains on a daily basis that if you're going to do real flow research, that may be some kind of a prerequisite. Aaron Dietrich was a long distance runner who, he ran through the natural world a lot. Like, it's a commonality among flow researchers over, 200 years at this point. And I don't know if that's exactly an answer to his childhood, but that is, a little bit more about sort of what I knew about him. A little bit.
You've told me a story before about a phone call you both had where he was giving you advice about how to make sure that you've got access to flow as you age.
Yeah, this was the last thing I wrote about in the newsletter. Is that I called the last question. I called him up. So I'd been reading all these things about him being a serious outdoorsman, and I, like everybody else, have seen his TED talk where he talks about being, World War II shaping flow and his experience in prison camps, things like that. But I literally called him up. It was like, Mike, I know what you've said on podcasts about your early childhood and flow and prison camps and the war, and what you've said about studying artists. But everything I read about you tells me you were a really serious rock climber. You knew some of the early kind of big British climbers. You knew some of the early Yosemite climbers. You have a very good grasp of technical climbing language. And I got to ask you, those are just stories you've been telling, right? Because what really happened is you started to get into weird flowy shit started happening in the mountains, and you wanted to know more about it, and you thought action sports were totally unacceptable in academia. So you came up with this other story. That was essentially what I said to him. And he was already not well at this point. So when the conversation started, before I asked this question, he was speaking slowly. I believe he was recovering from a stroke a little bit. He was still, so I didn't quite know where he was at. So I asked this question, and there was this enormous pause, just a huge. Mike was always a thoughtful thinker. So if you called him on the phone, I don't know what he was like with other people. With me, he would pause. And long pauses. So you had to, I was used to this pause, like it went on and on. And I started to think, have I insulted him? Did I cross a line? I could hear him breathing, so I knew he had to hug up. And what felt like a minute or two passed. And finally he said, you've got to be careful. And I was like, what the hell is going on here? As Mike lost, you got to be careful. What are you talking about, man? And I was like, oh, wow, maybe he's lost the thread. Maybe something happened to his brain and he's just not, Csikszentmihalyi anymore. And I didn't say anything. And finally he said, you do something your whole life for flow, and you get to be my age and forget about climbing mountains. Sometimes just getting out of bed is the mountain, and you have to be prepared for that. You have to be careful. And I thought, that was just one of the most generous, honest things anybody ever, you know what I mean? He was literally talking to me one flow junkie to another. And he was right. He was saying, look, dude, have a backup plan, because if action sports is your only gateway into flow, you're going to get to my age and you're going to be fucked. Take it from me. And I'm sure he had his backup plans and everything else, but it blew me away.
If what you've heard on Flow Research Collective Radio has been helpful, please consider doing us a solid and leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening to this. Reviews help us connect to a wider audience so we can get these peak performance principles out to more people.